Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give the warmest welcome to sui generis Jen. Please note this warning. We're about to play a video to remind us all what this is all about. On April the 5th, 2010, Wikileaks released a classified US military video that showed in graphic, horrifying detail the murder of over a dozen people, including 2 Reuters news staff in the Iraqi suburb of New Baghdad. The video quickly became known as Collateral Murder. By 2015, Wikileaks had published 2,325,961 diplomatic cables and other US State Department records comprising some 2 billion words. This stupendous and seemingly insurmountable body of internal state literature, which if printed would amount to some 30,000 volumes, represents something new. It represents a new era of encrypted Dropbox journalism, where publishers can meet their informants, hopefully in a secure environment, to get information to the public that is the public, it is argued, the public's right to know. As a consequence of those events in 2010, Julian Assange, as everybody now knows, has been isolated and incarcerated effectively for 7 years. Julian Paul Assange is the founder of Wikileaks, the new era which is transforming journalism around the world. Jennifer, you're just back from the UK. Can you please give this audience and the Australian public an update on the health and well-being of Julian Paul Assange? He's completed that abscond bail sentence in Belmarsh prison in the UK, but is being held in custody pending extradition to the United States of America.
Thank you, and first can I say thank you to Penn for hosting me here this evening and for honouring Julian through this event. I was with Julian on Tuesday in prison, just before I got on the flight to come here to be here with you tonight. And his health is obviously significantly and seriously deteriorated, not just from the time he spent in prison, but we have to remember that he was 7 years inside the Ecuadorian embassy without access to healthcare or an outdoor area or sunlight and 24-hour surveillance in circumstances where doctors who had assessed him were concerned about a serious permanent effect on his health, where the Ecuadorian government had sought to have permission to allow him to seek medical treatment outside of the embassy and was denied that by the British government, effectively making him choose between his right to asylum and his right to health. That was before he went into Belmarsh, where he's in the most high security prison in the United Kingdom on the healthcare ward, where he's in effective isolation for at least 20 hours a day, at least when he's not brought out for visits with us as his lawyers and the occasional social visit. So I think the health effects are best summed up by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who came to visit Julian in prison with the UN health team and doctors, and he said this: "It was obvious that Mr. Assange's health has been seriously affected by the extremely hostile and arbitrary environment he has been exposed to for many years. Most importantly, in addition to physical ailments, Mr. Assange showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma." Doctors that assessed him inside the embassy called upon the British Medical Association to call for his safe passage because they were so concerned about the impact on his health, and it remains today.
Does he have the legal supports necessary? It takes you a long time to get in to see him. Does he have the papers? He appeared disoriented at that last court appearance. He's up against a superpower. He says it's not fair. Does he have the supports?
Well, he's right. The United States, which is a superpower, has had almost 10 years to prepare this case. Since he's been in prison, there has been an ongoing fight about being able to bring papers in for him. Mail was going missing. It was taking weeks for anything we sent him to reach him, so he was without papers. After a significant fight, we're now able to hand him over the papers when we see him in prison, but he doesn't have adequate facilities. This is a huge case involving a significant amount of data and one that's incredibly complex. And I don't think that he has the facilities that are required to properly defend himself.
The extradition hearing has been set down for February now. Who hears that? A magistrate, a Supreme Court judge? Who?
It's initially heard before a magistrate in February, and then of course, depending on the outcome, there'll be a number of appeals potentially all over the Supreme Court.
So you've got a legal team on extradition?
We have a specialist legal team, some of the best extradition QCs in the country, working to defend Julian, and obviously we've already had a number of hearings. The main hearing will be in February.
But even though there was an appeal for more time in that last hearing, that was denied by the magistrate.
That's right.
So is there, if this magistrate says yes, we must allow the extradition, is there a right of appeal then up to a higher court?
There is a right of appeal all the way to the Supreme Court, and again, it depends on what happens, so we have to see what happens in February. In the meantime, of course, though, and speaking on the day of the imprisoned writer, Julian has now completed his sentence for breach of bail and is now being held on remand in prison at the request of the United States government, pending the outcome of this extradition process. This process could take 3 years. And I think it's really important to talk about what it's like to be in prison. So when I go to visit Julian, every time I get to Belmarsh, again, the highest security prison in the country, I can't help but be outraged each time by the injustice of a publisher sitting inside that building. I have to go and get my fingerprints scanned, have my ID checked, put all my belongings away, take nothing but papers into the building with me, go into another building where my ID is checked, my fingerprints are taken again, go through for a body search where prison guards go through my papers, go through another courtyard inside the prison walls where I go through another fingerprint and ID check, where there's a lovely little cafe run by volunteers, such are the austerity measures within UK prisons, where I might be able to get him a cup of coffee and a Kit Kat, and go through another round of security before I'm led past a range of consultation rooms filled with people accused of violent crimes and terrorist offences, to meet an Australian citizen who's facing prosecution for the publications for which he's won the Sydney Peace Prize and the Walkley Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Journalism. That is the situation that Julian Assange faces.
Now, Jennifer, the United Kingdom government will be the applicant to the court for extradition. It's the Attorney General in the UK has already signed off authorising this process. You'll be there with the extradition legal team for Julian Assange. What about the United States? Does it get representation in these proceedings?
Formally, under extradition proceedings, the UK Crown Prosecution Service acts as the agent of the United States government, so they are represented through the Crown Prosecution Service.
The discretion here was with the UK Attorney General to sign off on that, to sign off to say we are going to implement the process, we're going to accept the United States' application for extradition.
Yes, which is a relatively straightforward and standard process. Obviously, we now have the opportunity to be able to challenge that in courts, and that will happen in February. And there remains some discretion as to whether it would be enforced if extradition is ultimately ordered.
Is the Australian government providing more than what's known as consular assistance?
Absolutely not. And I think it's worth reflecting upon what the Australian government, has failed to do over the past 9 years. Looking back to 2010, when Cablegate first broke and Julian was first arrested, our then Prime Minister Julia Gillard wrongfully accused him of illegal conduct. Australia considered cancelling his passport to prevent his international travel. Soon after that, we were repeatedly asking the Australian government to seek the assurances to protect Julian from onward extradition to the United States. We have repeatedly asked for those assurances, which would have allowed him to go to Sweden and face trial and then return home to Australia if and when that process was over. The Australian government refused to ask for that. The Australian government has not, as far as I'm aware, raised any objection to the treatment of Julian Assange in the United States or their objection to his indictment under the Espionage Act and his prosecution and the extradition proceedings. One wonders, had the Australian government raised their concern and forcefully with the United States about the treatment of this Australian citizen, whether the Trump administration would have pursued these charges. Now we're in a situation where the Australian government is uniquely placed to raise concern about his treatment, about the ongoing extradition request and the criminal prosecution in the United States, which has been roundly criticised by major newspapers, free speech groups. The Australian government is in a strong position to raise this and put pressure on our ally to do the right thing.
In the proceedings, the extradition, which is now ongoing, the Australian government couldn't get standing in those proceedings even if it wanted to.
The Australian government can't.
Couldn't be a party.
Couldn't interfere with the court proceedings, but certainly the Australian government can be making representations to the governments involved.
So that would be ScoMo's, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison, direct to whomever wins the election on the 12th of December.
Both to the UK government and to the United States government.
Right. Let's talk about the indictment. This is the cover sheet for the indictment of Julian Paul Assange, now an enemy of the United States of America. As you can see, it's the USA versus Julian Paul Assange. There are 18 counts in the indictment covering conspiracy to receive national defence information, obtaining national defence information, disclosure of national defence information, conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. Take us through the substantive content of these counts, because you can read all this on the Wikileaks website. You can go and read all the indictment to get your heads across what the United States is saying. But Jennifer, we've got you here. What is the US claiming Julian Assange has done?
Well, I think first it's important to look back and to consider the publications that are the subject of this indictment. So he's facing 175 years in prison under this indictment, on the basis of this indictment, which relates to 3 separate publications: the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and Cablegate, the publication of US diplomatic cables. Now that takes us back to 2010. These are the publications that Chelsea Manning is alleged to have provided to Wikileaks. Chelsea Manning, who was prosecuted and has since had her sentence commuted by President Obama in one of his last acts before leaving the presidency, and is now back in prison under the Trump administration, indefinitely being fined on a daily basis for failing to give evidence in the Wikileaks grand jury. And I think it's important that we also recognise Chelsea Manning and her contribution and the treatment that she's suffering right now. So I think it's important to recognise the public interest in those publications and what we learnt from them. In the context of the Afghan and Iraq war logs, we learned that there were significant, hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths that weren't properly acknowledged by the governments and certainly kept from the public. We know that the US government knew of abhorrent abuse in detention centres and were not properly punishing it. You just saw evidence of a war crime on video that the US government had first claimed was in fact an attack on insurgents, but was, as WikiLeaks showed, a couple of journalists and unarmed civilians. If we talk about Cablegate, we learned that the US was spying on the UN and capturing their biodata. We learned about human rights abuse and corruption the world over. As a human rights lawyer, that material has been essential evidence in court cases around the world. In the case of El Masri before the European Court of Human Rights, a case of extraordinary rendition and torture, which was successful based on, in part, at least 6 WikiLeaks documents. I just this year argued the Chagos Islands case in the International Court of Justice. The Mauritian government relied on WikiLeaks cables. The Chagos Islanders have relied on the WikiLeaks cables in the domestic proceedings in the UK Supreme Court, and that material is now admissible in British courts, and certainly that will have impact on courts within the Commonwealth. This is incredibly important public interest material. For this publication, all 3 of these publications, WikiLeaks won the Sydney Peace Prize. Julian said once, if lies can start wars, then perhaps the truth can stop them. So it's not just about journalism awards, he's been nominated for consecutive years for the Nobel Peace Prize, 7 times or more since 2010, for these publications. So I think it's really important to locate this indictment in its context and the importance of the publications and the numerous journalism awards that have been won because of it. Now, the indictment itself, if you look at its, I don't want to get into the technicality of it because we'll be here all day and it's not interesting unless you're a lawyer. But what it boils down to is a journalist and a publisher having communications with a source, an allegation that had communications with a source, encouraged a source to provide information that that source had lawful access to, and have conversations with that source about protecting their identity, receiving that information and publishing it. That is why this indictment is so dangerous from a First Amendment and free speech point of view. The Freedom of the Press Foundation in the United States has said this is the most terrifying precedent for the First Amendment in the 21st century. The Washington Post and the New York Times have said that this indictment criminalizes public interest and typical investigative journalism practices. This is a very serious case and one that will have impact not just for Julian Assange but for all media organisations, and not just in the United States. This is one of the most terrifying things about this indictment and what the United States is doing in seeking his extradition. They are looking to prosecute someone who is not a US citizen, who was not in the United States, who has published information about the United States. This is why the International Federation of Journalists is concerned. This is why international groups are concerned that this, PEN International has said that this risks journalists and publishers everywhere in the world because of the precedent that it sets. That's what that indictment means.
It seems to me, reading the indictment, the most disturbing material against him is the charge of irresponsibility, paragraph 36, page 12. The State Department cables that Wikileaks published included names of persons throughout the world who provided information to the US government in circumstances in which they could reasonably expect that their identities would be kept confidential. These sources included journalists, religious leaders, human rights advocates, and political dissidents who were living in regressive regimes and reported to the US the abuses of their own governments and the political conditions within their countries at great risk to their own safety. By publishing these documents without redacting the human sources' names or other identifying information, Assange created a grave and imminent risk that the innocent people he named would suffer serious physical harm and or arbitrary detention. If true, if true, that would seem hard to defend. Is it true? And can you defend it?
Well, I think it's important to talk about WikiLeaks redaction processes in the process of that material. So I think it's important to talk about 2 things. First is the redaction processes and the harm minimisation process that WikiLeaks undertook for all of those publications, and I want to describe those. And second, I think associated with these risks to individuals is also the risk to harm, or national security, which is part of the irresponsibility argument that's made. And so I think a lot of people don't understand the process that WikiLeaks went through for each of these publications, which was a redaction process. I was not representing WikiLeaks at the time of the Iraq and the Afghan war logs, but there was absolutely a redaction process to try to protect against any harm to sources that were named in those documents. Certainly for Cablegate, I was involved in the negotiation of that, and there was a redaction process whereby the media partner was responsible for redaction. So I sat in a room at the Guardian's offices with Le Monde, El País, Der Spiegel, the New York Times and the Guardian, talking about this process and agreeing what it would look like. And what it meant was that they were to identify the cables that they wanted to report upon, they were to redact them, make their own assessment about redactions, and then WikiLeaks would publish them in a redacted form in line with the timetable of publication with the stories that had been agreed. Now, that was how the material came into the public domain initially, so there was a redaction and a harm minimisation process. It was only much later that the WikiLeaks cables were published unredacted online, but that was only after the Guardian, certain Guardian journalists published the password to the encrypted file and book, and the cables were then circulating online on numerous different websites. And this is a matter of public record, Julian Assange then took the decision at Wikileaks to publish the cables in unredacted form because they were already circulating online, and at that point, because they were already made public, he took the decision to publish them to allow those who were named in them to at least know themselves, since it was already circulating online and certainly amongst intelligence services.
Has the US government been able to point to anybody who has actually been harmed?
We have not heard of any incident where someone has been harmed, and I think it's also important to talk about harm to national security, and I wanted to quote a couple of things on that front. So the argument that's made is often, well, he damaged national security, and I think it's important to cite the US government's own material. The secret 2011 Defence Department report determined with high confidence that disclosure of the Iraq dataset will not have direct personal impact on current and former US leadership in Iraq. The report also discussed that there would be no significant impact on US war operations in Afghanistan. That's one report. A congressional official briefed on the review said the administration felt compelled to say publicly that the revelations had seriously damaged American interests in order to bolster legal efforts to shut down WikiLeaks and bring charges against the leakers. We were told the impact was embarrassing but not damaging, said the official. Former Defence Secretary and former CIA Director Robert Gates. Every other government in the world knows the United States government leaks like a sieve, and it has for a long time. The fact is, governments deal with the United States because it's in their interests, not because they like us, not because they trust us, and not because they believe we can keep secrets. Is this embarrassing? Yes. Is it awkward? Yes. Consequences for US foreign policy? I think fairly modest.
Let's talk now about the US-UK extradition treaty. That's the cover page. That's also online. Extraditions are usually for criminal offences like assault, murder, theft, fraud, the usual criminality. But receipt and publication of an applicant country's classified secret or top secret security information has never been grounds for extradition before, has it?
Well, I mean, this case is unprecedented in so many ways. It's the first time in US history that the Espionage Act has been used to charge a publisher, let alone to then seek the extradition of a foreign publisher back to the United States to face criminal prosecution. But this raises the point that was the subject of argument in the October hearing. So our US extradition team raised a preliminary point of importance, which is there is a bar to extradition for political offences, and Espionage Act offences are on their face political. So that will be part of the argument going forward.
That's why, Jennifer, we've got up there Article 4 of the UK-US extradition treaty says extradition cannot be permitted if the alleged offence is by definition political. Is this Julian Assange's best pathway to have the court reject extradition?
Well, as I said, it is going to be argued as a preliminary point. There will be other legal defences raised, but for obvious reasons we're not going to be disclosing what they are before the hearing.
And as you said, if you can't get it, if you can't halt the extradition at the magistrates level, you could take it to higher courts in the United Kingdom. Is there any case law in extradition which gives you and Assange's legal team hope that you can in fact prevent extradition?
Like I said, this case is so without precedent, it's very difficult to predict what will happen. I think certainly the case is one that is difficult, but I look forward to the challenge in February.
Okay, well, does this guy give you any hope? Now tell us about David Morales, the principal of UC Global, the Spanish security company, now also under indictment. What is it that Mr. Morales and his company are alleged to have done while providing security services to the Ecuadorian embassy in London?
So, this is the head of the company who was providing security services to the Ecuadorian embassy during the period that Julian was inside the embassy. What we discovered as a result of a whistleblower in Spain is that all of this information was being collected, including recordings of our legal meetings and surveillance of us as lawyers, and being given directly to the CIA. Yes. As a criminal complaint has now been filed by Julian in the Spanish courts, But this goes to show the level, not just the level of surveillance, and this is not just surveillance inside the Ecuadorian embassy, there's evidence of physical surveillance of my Spanish colleague Baltasar Garzón, in the context of a period in which we know that there was a break into his offices that they still haven't got to the bottom of. So I think it goes to show the level of the oppressive nature of the tactics being used against Julian and us as his legal team.
Well, it seems like dirty tricks of the Nixonian era. Yeah. You couldn't possibly comment, okay? Tell me, this gets to an important point for we journalists in this country and around the world, and there's a debate about amongst journalists in our brilliant careers, but is Julian Assange a journalist? If he is extradited to the United States, and important in this point, if he is extradited to the United States and faces those 18 counts listed in the indictment, and possibly more, does the great First Amendment of the great United States Constitution, freedom of the press, validated by the US Supreme Court when it found for the New York Times and the Washington Post in the Pentagon Papers case in the 1970s, will Julian Assange benefit from First Amendment protections because he is by definition a journalist?
Well, there's a number of different parts to that question. The first is he a journalist? And of course, thank you to the MEAA, who I know are here in the audience. Julian is a card-carrying member and recognised journalist of the Australian Media Union. He has written books. He has engaged in all kinds of journalistic practices that I think warrant the title journalist. And it's interesting, I have this debate with quite prominent members of the media in this country, and they're very certain of what a journalist is not, and it's not Julian Assange. But if I ask them how to define who a journalist is, they're unable to do it. And I think that's the point, which is, James Risen says this, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, that only in authoritarian regimes do we try to define what a journalist is and is not. And indeed, the Washington Post wrote a great piece saying that, the debate about whether you're a journalist or not is a red herring. In fact, the First Amendment applies to all. But the problem we have is that this is the Trump administration. The Trump administration who has said that the media is the enemy of the people. Mike Pompeo, then director of the CIA, now still a senior member of the administration, said that Wikileaks is a hostile non-state intelligence agency and that Julian Assange should not benefit from the First Amendment. And so there is a real risk that the Trump administration is going to argue that Julian Assange does not benefit from First Amendment protection. And I don't think that we can take that for granted.
And even if Trump is impeached and removed from the presidency by the Senate and or Joe Biden or Michael Bloomberg or Elizabeth Warren gets up as President of the United States, that's not necessarily any political comfort to Julian Assange as in the event that he's extradited to the United States.
If he's extradited to the United States, the issue is not just about it's whether he'll get a fair trial, it's the prison conditions that he'll be held in the meantime. How long the process would take, even if he is to benefit from the First Amendment, and there's still an argument about whether he would or not. That process could take a very long time.
So anyway, the action at the moment all rests on February and the extradition hearing it's in Belmarsh prison itself, isn't it? So the public can't get access?
It will be a public hearing at the Magistrates Court there.
So the public and the media can get access to it?
And they will have the great pleasure of the commute down to Belmarsh, which I love doing.
Of course. I just want to show you this is ABC alumni representing 300 former staff of the ABC. It views with dismay the failure of the federal government to object to the possible extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. This extradition has far-reaching consequences. It signals that the US believes publishers, editors and journalists anywhere in the world, including Australia, can be extradited if they obtain US classified documents. In the light of this attack on press freedom, this meeting instructs the ABC alumni executive to write to the Prime Minister requesting that he urgently demand an end to extradition proceedings against Assange and that Assange be returned to Australia. Now, Jennifer, what more can the people of Australia do to assist?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to get involved in the campaigning activities, and I wanted to mention that as depressing as it is in prison, Julian and I discussed on Tuesday the protest where someone scaled Parliament House, and it really made him smile. So I think I want everyone in this room who is involved in activities already to know that we do take news back to him, and it does make a really big difference. And he asked me, in fact, to pass on his sincere appreciation to Penn and to all of the supporters in the room who have been campaigning for him. But there are some concrete things that you can do, which is Andrew Wilkie has just started a parliamentarians group in Parliament in support of Julian. Please write to your MP and ask them to join that group. Continue to raise awareness about it, and if you feel able to contribute to the Courage Foundation, which is raising money to support Julian's legal defence and campaigns for him and other whistleblowers and publishers at risk.
It just seems to me that the First Amendment, this is a great test of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, similar to the Pentagon Papers. That's a proper perspective, isn't it?
Absolutely. It is the First Amendment case of the century, if it ever is tested in the United States. This is why you've had the Washington Post and the New York Times come out so forcefully about this. This is, in their words, criminalising public interest journalism that's been used to report in the public interest for decades. We've had Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, all kinds of free speech groups coming forward to say that this is basically criminalising journalism. Newsrooms in the United States are so worried about it, they don't know how to advise their journalists on what it is you can and cannot do. It's placing a massive chill on national security reporting, and that's dangerous.
Well, Julian will be pleased to know that News Corporation, the ABC and the Nine Network, now incorporating the old Fairfax papers, are in solidarity after the search warrant raids of Annika Smethurst of News Corporation journalists and the ABC officers over the Afghan files, and whatever complacency existed about Julian Assange, it seems to be now galvanised by the fight for press freedom in Australia. So it might be a happy confluence at last, Jennifer, that the things that make our democracy stronger, a free press, are now right up with all our newspaper executives and media executives in this country, and the politicians.
I think it's really important, and this is one of the things, look, it's better late than never. And we have been saying since 2010 that the criminal investigation itself in the United States set a chilling impact upon journalism, and that any indictment and prosecution of Julian Assange would risk the entire media. I feel like a broken record. I have been saying that over and over since 2010. And finally people are seeing it. And you cannot deny the parallels between what happened here in the police raids on the ABC and News Corp, raided for having received and published classified information about the Afghan war. What does that sound like? Precisely the indictment you see back there in the criminal investigation that was brought in respect of Julian Assange. So not only is the Australian government doing nothing to help this Australian citizen with respect to this investigation, we're picking up and running with it at home. And that's dangerous. And so I hope now that journalists in Australia are starting to understand what we have been saying since 2010. And I wish more opposition had been put up by the media at that time to have made it politically impossible for this indictment to have happened. We are where we are, but I think the Right to Know campaign in the media here is so important and should be used and continually used to push our government to do better, but also in the context of raising this case. I'm
not holding out much hope that News Corporation and Thea Rupert's going to be solid on that one, but at least that's momentum, I suppose. I put this up, the statement, there's the Media Alliance, of which Julian is now a member by the Walkley Foundation. In 2011, Wikileaks with Julian Assange as its editor received a Walkley Award in Australia for its outstanding contribution to journalism. Walkley judges said Wikileaks applied new technology to penetrate the inner workings of government to reveal an avalanche of inconvenient truths in a global publishing coup. One of those many inconvenient truths was the exposure of video by US helicopter attacks in Baghdad that killed 11 civilians, including 2 Reuters journalists. Many mainstream journalists work with Assange's material to publish their own reports, including media outlets such as the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age in Australia, The Guardian in the UK, The New York Times in the US, El Pais in Spain, Le Monde in France and Der Spiegel in Germany. There's been no attempt by the US government to prosecute any of those journalists involved. The government is relying on one allegation against Assange, that he helped Chelsea Manning crack a password to access a US government computer to seek his extradition from Britain to America, where, if successful, he seems likely to face other more serious charges that would constitute a direct assault on fundamental press freedoms. Julian Assange's personality and his more recent actions do not weaken the principle driving the Walkley Foundation's concerns in this matter, that when he released the original WikiLeaks material in 2010, Assange was assisting a whistleblower to reveal information in the public interest. Given the potential adverse impact of this extradition attempt on a free, healthily functioning media, the Walkley Foundation Board urges the British and Australian governments to oppose Julian Assange's extradition to the United States. I'm pleased to say that the journalists of Australia and their representative groups support Julian Assange. You mentioned our great Parliament House in Canberra, and Andrew Wilkie. He's the former intelligence analyst who resigned rather than be part of the fabricated intelligence used by Australia, the US and the UK to justify the coalition of the Willings invasion of Iraq in 2004. Andrew Wilkie has formed, as Jennifer said, a parliamentary support group for Julian Assange. It includes independents, Greens, Labor, Liberals and Nationals, including Barnaby Joyce. What more can we do? You've said everybody write to their MP or their senator to get them to agitate about support for Julian.
That's right. I mean, with anything, we have to put sufficient pressure on our elected officials to take action. And they're not going to move on this issue unless we call on them to do so. So I think a bigger grassroots campaign in Australia of concerned Australian citizens can make a difference. It did for David Hicks, and it can for Julian Assange.
And for Matthew Ricketson here.
James Ricketson,
sorry. James Ricketson, who was... the other thing was Change.org has, with Philip Adams, has just produced 200,000 signatures on a petition which was presented to the Senate yesterday. So thanks very much for Change.org. Finally, Jennifer, what about you? 9 years of representing Julian Assange. Do you have a therapist? I know you're tough as nails, but it's pretty trying, given all that you've been through to represent your client.
Well, I mean, it has been a very long 9 years, longer for Julian than for anyone else. But it's quite remarkable to look at the history of this case and how much he's been through. Because if I look back on it and I reflect, I walked him into the police station in 2010 when he was first arrested. I was with him when we were negotiating Cablegate. That period, they shut down his bank accounts. The Australian government was threatening to cancel his passport. An Interpol arrest notice. A WikiLeaks task force set up by the United States government to figure out ways to prosecute him. A grand jury investigation. It was just one thing after another. Financial blockade. All of the major credit card companies shut down any way of donating to WikiLeaks, depriving them of the income from the public that was allowing them to continue to operate. Chelsea Manning's prosecution. I mean, you heard the list of cases I've had to work on. It's just the legal complexities that he has been tied up in because of what he's chosen to do are remarkable, and I still it is difficult and sometimes overwhelming and very stressful because of the sheer size and complexity of these issues. But I will always remember a conversation I had with Julian in 2010, just after he published the Iraq War logs. He said to me, Jen, I have 250,000 diplomatic cables and I'm about to publish them. And I did not understand the significance of what he told me. I don't think anyone would have understood the significance of what that was going to mean in terms of the size of the story and what it would mean globally, impacting every single country in the world. And he said to me, the US will chase me to the end of the earth and make my life hell. But it is my obligation to the source and to the public and to history to publish this material because it is in the public interest and it reveals war crimes and abuse the world over, and I have to do it. It's my obligation to do it. And he knew what was about to happen. I didn't appreciate that, and he did it for reasons which I think were noble and in line with Wikileaks' mission. And he deserves the awards. He won for that. But the persecution that he's suffered since, I hadn't anticipated what was going to happen, and it continues to this day, and it's a privilege to have worked with him and to work with the lawyers that I've got to work with on this case. Some of the best human rights lawyers in the world have come to his defence. Baltasar Garzón, who was responsible for issuing the arrest warrant for Pinochet and starting the international justice movement. Jeffrey Robertson QC, our great Australian human rights lawyer. Michael Ratner, who's now passed away, the then president of the Centre for Constitutional Rights. Gareth Pearce, who's representing him now in the extradition proceedings. These are remarkable lawyers who I've had the privilege of working with and learning from in this case, but it's certainly not easy. But like I said, compared to what Julian's going through, we all crack on.
Good on you. All right. We've got some questions. Mark, can you fire these questions to us?
Yes, I can, Zoe. Yeah, we've got some wonderful questions from the audience. Thank you very much for that conversation, that was fascinating. So the questions from the audience have been texted to me, and me and Zoe will read them out. The first one will be, Jennifer, are the conditions of Assange's imprisonment affecting his psychological and medical fitness to stand trial? It's a double question. And what are the legalities of forcing a medically and psychologically compromised person to stand trial?
In terms of course, the conditions that he's been held in, like I said, both in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years and then now in prison are incredibly difficult and have put him under significant physical and psychological pressure. He was inside of effectively 2 rooms for 7 years under 24-hour surveillance. There was physical police surveillance for a large proportion of that time, so even talking in the kitchen in the Ecuadorian embassy, you'd see a police officer outside the kitchen trying to listen in and guarding the exit. It was really oppressive, and now in healthcare, the way he is, he's very much isolated. To the extent that that will affect his ability to stand trial, that remains to be seen.
Will a leadership change in either the British or American governments affect Julian's case?
Potentially, in the UK at least, Jeremy Corbyn has already made clear that he does not think that Julian Assange ought to be extradited. There is limited discretion for the Home Secretary to prevent extradition, so if it were a Corbyn government it might look differently, but again it remains to be seen. A change in the United States, I would hope that any government of the United States, Republican or Democratic, would reflect on this indictment and decision and close down the prosecution.
The Labor Party's, Australian Labor Party's attitude to Assange hasn't changed, has it? Is there any support there from Albo?
Well, we'll have to ask Albo.
We will.
And just while I have it, this is our Vice President of Sydney Zoe. I should have introduced her at the start. Julian, do you want to say anything?
Thank you.
Yes, I can. Zoe, read this. I should have introduced her at the start. Did the Australian High Commissioner block Julian's access to consular support, or did he refuse their help?
George Brandis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Julian has continued to request consular assistance, but the point is not just about consular assistance. Consular assistance is every Australian citizen deserves it. What is needed in this case is more than consular assistance. It's the Australian government actually making political representations to the US and to the UK, and that's what they're refusing to do.
Yeah.
Is there any hope of getting Judge Emma Arbuthnot recused for conflicts of interest, specifically her husband being named in the Wikileaks files numerous times?
Yes, there was some controversy about her sitting in the case. She will not be sitting in the case going forward.
You know who?
I'm not sure.
Not sure, okay.
Please, actually.
Sorry, we have to go then and Google the background of the judicial officer.
Do you think the sexual abuse allegations taint support for Julian, or are you able to separate the two?
I do think that the Swedish case has had the impact of splitting support for Julian in ways that are really unfortunate. I have to say again, that case was only ever at preliminary investigation stage. He's never been charged, and the case has not progressed, nor do we expect it to. The case now that everyone needs to focus upon is the one that he actually faces, which is 175 years in prison.
And the UK doesn't extradite people to countries with capital punishment. Will you appeal on this ground? And that's from a contributor to this edition of the magazine, Alison Brynowski.
Well, at this point, he's not facing capital punishment, so it's not part of the case. But of course, the conditions of imprisonment and the length of sentence that he's facing is obviously impressive and will be part of the challenge.
What is the likelihood of Julian's condition in prison improving?
That's an ongoing battle, and I think that the conditions inside Belmarsh prison are a real problem, and it speaks to the difficulties of austerity cuts and the like. And I know that there's ongoing concerns and questions being asked about Julian's current position.
If Julian is released, do you think he will return to Wikileaks and again publish dangerous truths, or simply retire and remain quiet? For which
Look, I think he would love to come home to Australia and, will probably continue to do what he does, but at the moment we just have to face the
One step at a time.
one step at a time. Getting him out of prison will be a good start.
This is actually a question from Sydney Penn based on our conversations before the event, which when Quentin asked you about how you were doing, you sidestepped the question quite nicely by talking about how difficult it was for Julian. So I want to return to that question because you gave us some pretty interesting answers about the physical, or the toll it has on you and over the past decade, essentially.
Well, I think it's a constant battle to not allow the situation to become normalised. So I never expected to be visiting Julian Assange inside an embassy. In fact, if someone had told me that when I first started representing him, I would not have believed them. Nor would I have believed that Donald Trump would be president of the United States. Nor would I have believed that they actually would have charged him with 175 years in prison. It's so outrageous. But there's been so much going on for so long. There's been so many injustices against him, and maintaining a sense of outrage at each one and not allowing it to become normalised has been a constant battle. There's also been, I think, we just heard about it, the State Department. I've been the subject of Lawyers' Rights Watch complaints because of the treatment that I received by the US State Department. Publishing a letter to the media accusing myself along with Julian together with Julian as his lawyer, of endangering national security. You just heard evidence of the spying, the unlawful spying by a company aiding the CIA on our phone calls, conversations, and our professional work. it's oppressive and sometimes overwhelming. But like I said, I have had the benefit of working with some of the world's best human rights lawyers who have been an incredible group of, or team to work with, and are inspiring to work with. So.
Belmarsh Court has only 3 public seats. Can the February hearing be moved to Westminster Court 1, where there are more public seats?
I agree that public access to the court has been really problematic, and there are so many supporters who turn up to the hearings who want to attend and see this hearing. People forget, but Julian's first hearing was the first ever hearing in which tweeting was allowed from a courtroom, because there was just so much public interest and so many people who wanted to participate and understand what was happening in the hearings. So it is a constant battle in these magistrates' courts for there to be sufficient seating, and I think it's great that people continue to turn up to be there, and because open justice is so important in terms of making sure the judiciary does its job.
How do you protect yourself and your personal communications? And give us the secrets.
Well, the Five Eyes is here, but hello, here you go.
Well, I have my personal tracking device that I carry around. Look, with all correspondence I think lawyers have to be very careful now. What we know as a result of Snowden's revelations and Wikileaks revelations is the extent of surveillance. To think that as a lawyer we are protected from that, I think that was blown out of the water from what we've learnt post-Snowden of the UK and US government's surveillance of lawyers. We have now more proof again in the criminal complaint in Spain of the extent to which I was under surveillance, probably still am. So of course we use encryption and other protected encrypted methods of communicating with each other, and unfortunately going back to old basic methods of not using phones and email and writing notes.
There's no such thing as legal professional privilege.
Well,
anymore.
There is, and there ought to be, and it's a shame that democratic governments are no longer respecting that as the fundamental principle it is.
You'd think after the ordeal of the people of Hong Kong in trying to maintain their democratic rights against Xi Jinping, concerns about Xi Jinping under one country, two systems, that our government would think again about this. But we seem to be in a completely different era to try to protect your secrets, even the embarrassing ones that expose your failings. So that's a comment. Yes.
Could the charges of receiving and obtaining government secrets also be levelled against, for example, the New York Times over the same documents?
Of course they could. Of course they
could. They could go there.
Well, as the New York Times themselves have said, as this criminalises typical journalistic activity. And New York Times in-house counsel Dave McCraw, who's a fantastic lawyer, said once to a group of judges, you cannot distinguish between what Wikileaks did and what the New York Times did in respect of these publications, at least with respect to receipt and publication. So absolutely this precedent could apply and will apply under a Trump administration where the press is the enemy of the people. It will apply to them.
Yep. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank Penn and thank Jennifer Roberts.